So, what is emotion? Emotion is a feeling state. It's when you feel things, and those feelings can have physical parts, cognitive parts, and behavioral parts. So you can have physical reactions to emotion, cognitive interplay with emotion, and behavioral outcomes because of emotion. And so we have a real chicken and the egg kind of issue here of which comes first. Is it the physical response, the cognitive response, the behavioral response? Does emotion happen and then you have all of this, or do the physical responses cause the emotion? Okay, so that's what we're going to answer with the next 3 theories that we cover in emotion. So the question is, does your heart pound because you're afraid, meaning you have the emotion and then a physical response? Or are you afraid because you feel your heart pounding? So you have the physical factor followed by emotion. So how do emotions affect us? Well, they activate our ANS. That is a nervous system. What type of nervous system am I talking about that's involuntary?
Autonomic.
Autonomic. Your autonomic nervous system is your involuntary branch, and it's broken up into 2 parts, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system is your fight or flight. That's when your emotions are triggered. Your parasympathetic nervous system is what calms you down after fight or flight. So sympathetic is fight or flight, parasympathetic is rest and digest. This is the nervous system that we correlate most strongly with emotion. So the 3 theories that we're going to learn about with emotion are the 2-factor theory, the Cannon-Bard theory, and the James-Lange theory. Now, the 2-factor theory involves cognition. These 2 don't. No cognition for Cannon-Bard, no cognition for James-Lange. So with the 2-factor theory, you have to actually think about what you're going through. The first factor is the physical factor, the external. The second factor is the emotional, the internal. And you have to determine, based on your environment, what type of emotion you're feeling. The second theory says that your physical reaction and your emotional reaction happen at the exact same time. There's no cause and effect. There's no, let's think about it, what emotion am I feeling? It's that they both happen at the same time. So I like to think of the Cannon-Bard theory as 2 cannons firing at the same time. The James-Lange theory says that actually there is a causal relationship. You have a physical reaction that causes an emotion. So first physical, then emotional, as opposed to the common sense theory that says first you're emotional and then you physically react to that emotion. So it's important that you know all 3 of these theories and how they play out. And we're going to go through them in detail. So the 2-factor theory, and I call it that because I have a very hard time pronouncing this guy's name. Schachter. Yeah, I was just like, whatever. The 2-factor theory in emotion says that there are 2 factors or 2 responses. The first one is the physical response. So like, let's say you have a perception of an oncoming car. Your physical response, physiological, is your pounding heart. Your heart starts racing. Then you pause, and the second factor is you thinking, you labeling what emotion you must be experiencing based on the context in which you experience. Because the message, like a pounding heart, can be ambiguous. A pounding heart could mean you just finished exercising. A pounding heart could mean you're scared. It could mean that you're in love. That's pretty ambiguous. So how do you determine which emotion you're feeling based on that message? Well, you have to look at your environment. What's the context of what's going on? If you see a car coming on into your lane, your heart isn't beating because you're in love with the car. Your heart is beating because you're afraid that it's about to hit you. So you label that beating heart as fear. So you see something, you feel something, you label what you're feeling, and that is your emotion. We consider context in order to label the emotions that we experience. That's why it's called 2-factor. Physical response, then the cognitive labeling. Now, the Cannon-Bard theory is going to say, nope, that's not how it happens. Because when you experience an emotion, do you sit around and you're thinking, okay, what do I call this? What's going on around me so I can figure out what I'm feeling? Like, no, it typically is just like they happen at the same time. So Walter Cannon and Philip Bard So that actually what happens is you get the visual perception that sends a message to your sympathetic nervous system, but it also triggers an emotion at the same time. There is no cognition involved in this theory. They're just both happening at the exact same moment. So how does this happen physically in our brain? This happens because the thalamus, which remember is our relay system, it's where all of our senses go before they're filtered away to go to the occipital lobe or the frontal lobe or the temporal lobe. Your thalamus is what receives all of this sensory information. And then your thalamus sends it to the appropriate lobe. Okay, so in the Cannon-Bard theory, they say, hey, you see a snake, you see something scary. That sends a message to your thalamus, which is going to automatically send a message to your amygdala saying fear, and it's going to send an emotion to your limbic system. It has a physical response of your sympathetic nervous system getting triggered, but it also has an emotional response of fear. So there's no delay, and the thalamus is the reason for that. So think of the Cannon-Bard theory as two cannons firing at the same time. Your heart races and your emotion of fear occurs. The third theory was discovered by William James, who should be a familiar name. He's the founder of Psychology in America, and Carl Lange. They believed that there was a causal relationship, that first you have a physical response, and then you have an emotional response because of the physical response. So when your fight or flight system is triggered externally, your body responds first, and then you have the emotion. So it's not happening at the same time, but also it is not involving cognition. You're not stopping and thinking, why is my heart beating? Your heart is beating, and because of that, your brain registers fear. This is the opposite of common sense theory, where you feel an emotion like fear, and that causes your heart to race, which to me makes more sense. Hence why it's called common sense theory. So if it doesn't make common sense, why is this theory one of the theories that we're studying? Well, because there is some support for this theory that our physical actions affect our emotions. They studied subjects where they had them watch really sad scenes, like of war and sickness and starvation, and they had them purposely make their face express the emotion of sadness before watching it. So they're like, when you're about to watch this movie, I need you to frown. I need you to be sad looking. And they reported that they felt more sad than people who had a neutral facial expression. So by changing their behavior, by making their muscles go into the formation of sadness, it actually had an effect on their emotions, a cause and effect, according to this study. So if you can do that with sadness, can you do it with happiness? Turns out you can. If you had people go ahead and smile before they read a funny comic, they would find the comic to be funnier. So they're physically activating their muscles, and that has an effect on their emotions. This is called the facial feedback hypothesis. When we change our feelings by changing our behavior. So smiling when you're in a bad mood might actually help alleviate that bad mood. Unless you were put in that bad mood because a man told you you'd be so much prettier if you smiled, then you're not going to be happy. Nathan's like, do people do that? Yes, they do. Then like, I'm going to be the saddest face you've ever seen. So if you're feeling sad, it might be better for you to put on a comedy on Netflix. Don't turn on your sad playlist on Spotify. Turn on the happy playlist or watch something funny, because that can change your facial expression, which according to James Lange's theory, could have an effect on your actual emotional well-being. Now, I do have a video explaining all of this, and in addition to explaining the facial feedback effect, it also talks about how some emotions are universal, regardless of age, gender, race, culture. There are certain emotions that even babies can register because they're innate. Smiling is one of those universal expressions. Smiling is a sign of friendliness and approval. So sometimes when I make eye contact with students in class, they'll smile at me. It's a metaphorical thumbs up, like, yes, I'm here, I'm listening. And that gets me through. As opposed to if I'm just staring at them and they're just like daring me to continue teaching. Now, why is smiling something universal for the human species, but maybe not for animal species? Well, think about it. If a dog shows his teeth at you, is he smiling? Probably not. So you probably shouldn't just smile at random animals and be like, hey, I'm universally showing friendliness and approval. Like, no, you're burying your teeth at them. You don't want that smoke. Criticism for the James Lange theory. Well, they state that you have a physical reaction that causes your emotion, but sometimes it's difficult to differentiate those ambiguous physical signals. If your heart is pounding, that can mean a lot of different things. It could mean that you're nervous, you're afraid, you're in love. It could mean that you just exercised. And so how is your body supposed to interpret that physical signal without cognition to explain the context of it? Also, arousal is associated with the autonomic nervous system. Your sympathetic nervous system tells you fight or flight. Your parasympathetic nervous system says digest and rest. So if you're supposed to have a physical response that causes your emotions, then how do we have a nervous system sending emotions that triggers us to fight or flight or freeze? So like with other theories we've covered in sight and audition, it's not so much that there's one theory that's absolutely right. It's probably more likely that there are multiple theories that you got to just kind of clump together to get a full spectrum answer to how does this work. So emotion is hard. It is multifaceted. If you're going to define it, you're going to have to look at different layers behind emotion. This includes physical effects of emotion, like your heart beating, expressive behaviors, so behaviorism, and your conscious interpretation of the emotion, so cognitive psychology. So it's not just one or the other, it's multiple put together. So let's review the three theories real quick. If emotion occurs the same time as arousal, what theory? Cannon-Bard, good, Grace. What if the emotion comes after arousal or is caused by the physical response?
James Lange.
James Lange, exactly right. What about if the arousal is cognitively labeled as an emotion?
Factor.
Good, the two-factor theory. So let's apply that to this example. You're on a roller coaster and you feel excited. Tell me how, using the two-factor theory, the Cannon-Bard theory, and the James Lange theory. Let's start with the two-factor theory. What are the two factors?
Some like cognitive arousal and like label.
The cognitive arousal is the label, so you label it cognitively, but what are you labeling? What causes you to think, I need to label this? So yeah, Ella Beth said, if you feel your heart pound, that's the first factor, the physical response. Your heart is pounding. You stop to think, why is my heart pounding? Well, look at your environment. You're on a roller coaster that hopefully you willingly chose to get on. So you could say, oh, I'm a thrill seeker. I'm excited to be on this roller coaster at Six Flags. And so the feeling I must be having is excitement as opposed to fear or being in love with the roller coaster. Because if you're in love with the roller coaster, then we need to have a talk. Oh, actually, no, don't talk to me about that. I can find you somebody to talk to, someone qualified. So that's the two-factor theory. First, you have a physical response, and then the second factor is you label that response. What about the Cannon-Bard theory? How would it explain the feeling of excitement? With the Cannon-Bard, think cannons.
So is it that like we just simultaneously experience that increase in blood pumping or heart pounding along with the excitement that we feel or enjoyment, I guess, on the roller coaster?
Exactly right. They happen at the same time. Your heart pounds and you feel excited, like two cannons firing at the same time. What about the James Lange theory?
The physical event causes your emotion directly.
Exactly right. The physical response causes your emotional response. Your heart is beating, and that leads you to feel excited. You're not cognitively labeling it. It's just happening. Not at the same time. There's a delay. There's a causational effect, but it is happening. Excellent job. So, why do we have emotions in the first place? Well, evolutionarily, they must be beneficial, and fear is beneficial when it comes to survival. The amygdala is our brain's center for fight or flight, for fear and aggression. Loss or damage of your amygdala is bad. Now you may think, oh, not feeling fear is a good thing. Well, I mean, it's kind of like not feeling pain. Pain and fear serve a purpose. They're supposed to warn you when something's wrong. So if you don't have that fear response, then your reaction time is slowed down significantly. So the amygdala is very important in processing fear in your environment to make sure you react in a way that allows you to pass on your genetic code to future generations. And so, how do we have such a quick reaction to fear? Well, it's because the amygdala has a shortcut in the brain so that we can have an instant fear response. If the James Lange theory or the two-factor theory were true, it would take us a really long time for us to react to fearful stimuli in our environment. Just think about it. With the two-factor, you feel your heart pound, and then you have to think about, what does that mean? I must be afraid. By that time, the snake's probably already bitten you. You want a reflex. As soon as you see the snake, your brain immediately goes into jump away from the death mode. So the amygdala bypasses all of our messaging system, like in the frontal lobe, and it doesn't require conscious thinking. Instead, you have an immediate reaction instead of slowing down to think of what to do. So certain likes, dislikes, and fears can precede cognition, especially with like taste aversion. Or like if you take a sip of spoiled milk, are you going to stop and hold it in your mouth and think, when was the last time I purchased this milk? Like, no, as soon as you taste it's funny, you're going to spit it out like a reflex. And that's evolutionarily beneficial. But there are other emotions beyond fear, not that I would know. But how do we process those emotions, especially when it comes to interacting with other people? Well, we tend to compare ourselves to others. And this typically is not in our best interest. The adaptation level phenomenon is the human tendency to judge what you're going through based on what you've already encountered and based on what other people are going through. So it's relative. For instance, if I won the lottery right now for $1 million, I'd probably be pretty stoked. But would I be happy for the rest of my life? No. Because according to the hedonic treadmill, or the hedonistic treadmill, the novelty of that achievement or of that money would eventually wear off. I would become adapted to it. I would become used to having that kind of money, and it wouldn't be as exciting anymore. Think about it if you ever go to work out. If you're on a treadmill and you're just starting to work out, you're not going to go full speed ahead, right? You're going to start at a light jog. Then after a week, maybe you get tired of the light jog. You're good. You can move up to the next level, maybe go uphill a little bit. But you are going to get accustomed to each of those levels, thus driving you to move up to the next level. The same thing happens with us cognitively in terms of our achievements or in terms of money. So money does not buy happiness, although I would like to be a part of that case study if they ever want to see if I can be an exception to that. Like, I know money can't buy happiness, but I'd much rather cry in a Lamborghini. So that age-old question of, does money buy happiness? Well, according to this, it does not. If you look at this chart, it looks at GDP per capita in the United States. That's the orange line. The orange line is increasing. That means wealth is increasing. So if there is a causal relationship, then we would see happiness, which is represented here by these blue diamond shapes, or life satisfaction increasing along with that orange line. But instead, it remains fairly stagnant. So we don't see an increase in happiness or life satisfaction tied to an increase in money. Relative deprivation is when we compare ourselves to others. And if people have things better than us or have more than us, then we start feeling that about ourselves. Relative deprivation is a type of upward social comparison. And typically, when you engage in a lot of upward social comparison, this has a negative effect on your self-esteem because you'll start to perceive that you have it worse off than other people. Now, when this occurs in groups, it can lead to riots, like in the French Revolution with the Third Estate. They saw that the nobles and the king and the queen were living in Versailles and living it up and having fireworks and cake, and they were putting sawdust into their flour to stretch their bread ration. So that led to that relative deprivation, the upward social comparison, and heads started rolling. If you want the new iPhone for your birthday, and your parents buy it for you. Are you going to be happy? Yes, because you got the new iPhone. You got what you wanted. Okay, but then you run over to your friend's house to show off your phone, and they're like, oh, that's great. My parents just bought me a new car. Well, then you might start that upward social comparison. You might think, oh, this phone can't drive me anywhere. And you might start thinking they have it better off than you do, and thus your life satisfaction is going to decrease. As opposed to if you do downward social comparison. If you look at people who are worse off than you, then you're more likely to be satisfied with what you have. But suffering is not a competition. You don't have to be the one who's suffering the most in the world to have a validation of what you're going through. We all go through it, different times, different levels, but it's across the human spectrum. How do we determine happiness if not through money? Well, researchers have found that people who report being happier tend to have higher self-esteem, especially if they're in individualistic countries like Western countries. They tend to be optimistic about the future, extroverts, they're agreeable, they have many close friendships, or they have a satisfying marriage. They have hobbies that engage their skill, they like their job. Meaningful religious faith could play a role in that. And also their physical needs are taken care of. They sleep well and they exercise regularly. So if you're looking to increase your happiness, maybe get more sleep, take a nap, or exercise, or be optimistic. Happiness does not seem to be closely correlated with age. So it's not a matter of, oh, you're a teenager, so you're going to be angry, or oh, you're 30, so you feel like you're old and you're going to be midlife crisis, all that stuff. It's not related on gender. It's not related to education levels, having a children or not having children. It's not based on physical attractiveness. Another thing that leads towards happiness is doing good for other people. Now, if you feel good, you're more likely to be helpful. So you're going to be helpful more often if you're in a good mood. Like if I go to the grocery store and I'm already ticked off about something, like I've got a parent email or something, and then I pull into my parking space and I see a cart in the parking lot that someone didn't put away. So if I'm not feeling good, I'm not likely to go out of my way to get that cart. If I am feeling good, like I just listened to a bop on the radio and I'm like, yeah, I'm going to go buy me some ice cream, then I might be more likely to get that cart and return it. And that's a sign of character, y'all. If someone doesn't put their own cart away, they're a bad person. There's just no exception. Like, don't leave your cart in the parking lot. Put it where it belongs. Also, subjective well-being. The most common measurement of happiness, satisfaction, and quality of life looks at physical as well as economic indicators, not necessarily meaning that you need all the money or you need to be rich, but if you have enough to reach that bottom layer of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you're too worried about where you're going to sleep at night or what you're going to eat, or if you're going to be able to pay the bills, then your subjective well-being is probably not going to be very high. If you have most of your basic needs taken care of, then there's a chance your subjective well-being would be much higher. Next, we're going to talk about universal facial expressions. There tend to be 6 to 8 basic emotions that you don't have to learn. You're just innately born to recognize. So let's practice and see if you can recognize the expressions on these baby faces. So what emotion is baby A experiencing? Happiness, exactly right. What emotion is baby B experiencing? They are angry. That is one angry baby. What about baby C? Old man is not an emotion, Tucker. Surprise. Good. You can tell by the wide eyes. What about baby D?
Disgust.
Disgust. Exactly. Baby E. This one might be difficult because interest is actually an emotion. So that baby is intrigued. What about baby F?
Depressed.
Yeah, that's a sad baby. And then baby G.
Afraid.
Afraid. That baby is terrified. Okay, so we can register, we can recognize those emotions on human faces without ever having to be taught them in a PowerPoint or in a classroom because they're universal across the human species. So another word for emotion is affect. I know y'all probably heard words like, oh, that is an effect of such and such, or that affected me in a certain kind of way. Effect with an E is a noun. Affect with an A is a verb. But this is the form of affect that's a noun that specifically refers to emotion. So if you say someone has a flat affect, exactly right, Ella Beth, like the emoticon that you just used, that means they have no emotion showing on their face. Okay, so that could be someone in a dissociative state, it could be a symptom of schizophrenia, or it could be a symptom of sociopathy. Okay, so affect in terms of emotion helps us with determining signs and symptoms of psychopathology or clinical psychology, some diagnoses that we can make from that. Now, there's some argument on whether we have 6 universal emotions across the human race or 8. Plutchik counters the 6 universal emotion theory with his psychoevolutionary theory, where we have 8 emotions. So in addition to the emotions that we have listed here, happiness through fear, we also have anticipation and trust as a universal emotion. And the reason that we have all of these emotions is because they are evolutionarily beneficial to us, hence it being called the psychoevolutionary theory. All humans can recognize and express these emotions because it is adaptive for our survival. So if you're coming across another group of humans back in the hunter-gatherer days or the caveman days, and they smile at you, that's a sign of universal friendliness and approval. If they look angry at you, then you're probably going to move to a different territory. You're like, let's go down and find another river to camp out at tonight. Okay, so it's a way of communication. Now, as you evaluate emotions, there are different factors that contribute to those emotions. So valence determines whether it's a positive or negative emotion. Is this a pleasant or unpleasant emotion? So happiness and joy, that's positive valence. Anger, that's negative valence. So whether it's a pleasant or unpleasant emotion. Arousal is the level of intensity of that emotion, the degree to which you feel that emotion. If you're joyous, then that's a very high intensity of that emotion of happiness. If you're so angry that you punch drywall, then that's a high level of intensity and you're probably named Kyle. And so high intensity or arousal illustrates the degree to which you feel that emotion. Valence illustrates whether it's positive or negative, pleasant or unpleasant. And then you also have to look at the motivation of that emotion. Are you displaying that emotion for a reward or to avoid punishment? Like if you're laughing at a funeral, you're probably going to be in trouble. Although laughing in response to death is not an uncommon reaction because you're going into shock. So if you ever see someone laughing after they're told like really devastating news, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're not sensitive to what's going on. Or if you've ever heard the phrase like, if you're crying and your parents are like, you're crying, I'll give you something to cry about. Well, then to avoid punishment, you'll stop crying. So your motivation for hiding or showing an emotion. Now, whereas Plutchik said that there are 8 basic emotions, these are not the only emotions that we experience, but all other more complex emotions are based on a combination of those basic 8. So you have different levels of intensity that combine with other emotions to create something more complex, kind of like with the color wheel. You take primary colors, you combine them, and it makes a new color. So blue plus yellow equals green. Well, if you combine anger and disgust, which are 2 of the universal emotions, that combines to create the emotion of contempt. So just like with the color wheel, you can combine emotions to further express feelings. Now, how do we draw upon our environment to determine what feeling we are experiencing? Well, context matters, especially if we're trying to interpret emotions outside of our own. Okay, that's where it gets really difficult. It's a lot easier for us to look internally and say, cognitive appraisal with the 2-factor theory, I have a physical reaction and now I'm going to label this emotion based on my context. But what if you're trying to label an emotion that someone else is experiencing? So if someone's crying, they could be happy or they could be sad. They could be crying tears of joy, like they're at an airport and they're reunited with a family member. Or they could be really sad because they ran out of Oreo cookies and the grocery stores are closed. That's worth crying over. Your context helps with the interpretation not only of your emotions, like with the two-factor theory, but also with others' emotions. So for instance, this context, we already know from our last unit that these two figures are the same size and they're the same creature. But based on the context of this photo, we interpret their emotions differently. So let's call this one A, let's call this one B. Based on the context, which of the universal emotions would you assume figure A is experiencing, and why? He's too big for the hallway. Anger, so the bared teeth, and he's bigger and he's further away. So you might look at figure A and say he is expressing anger and he's chasing this smaller figure who's actually a mirror image of this figure. You use the context of being bigger and farther away and looking like it's chasing something to assume, oh, the context of this is that this is a big angry guy and he's chasing the little guy. Now the figure B, like Ella Beth says, is probably, we're more likely to determine that it is experiencing fear because it looks like he's running away from his big oversized doppelganger. So based on the context of this photo, we can say A is angry and he's chasing someone. B is scared and he's being chased, even though they're showing the exact same face. Y'all may remember in the two-factor theory, we have two factors, it's in the name. The first one is the physical reaction to stimuli, and then we cognitively think and label what emotion we're experiencing, which is factor 2, in order to determine what's going on, and that's based on our environment. So first we have a physical reaction like a beating heart, and so we appraise what our environment is in order to have that beating heart. So first factor is physical, second factor is cognitive appraisal. So the way we label our emotions and other people's emotions determines on our perception of the event. If you're good at this, this is called emotional intelligence. If you're good at it, identifying what emotion you're going through, if you're good at identifying what other people are going through, then that is emotional intelligence. You don't have to have a PhD in order to have high emotional intelligence. I've known very, very smart people that aren't very good at reading people. They aren't very good at being sensitive to other people's emotions. So if these emotions are universal and we all show signs of those emotions, how do we interpret them? Well, even though facial language is universal, even though we show the same facial movements for happiness, sadness, anger, all of those, we do have different cultural rules on how we display them. Those are called display rules. So cultures have different rules about how and when they show emotion. In Western cultures, we're very emotional. You see airports, families connecting, yelling, screaming, crying, hugging, all of that. If you watch The Bachelorette, I saw an episode where the Bachelorette runs up to the Bachelor and she like jumps and he lifts her up and she wraps her arms, legs around him. And you're just like, okay, that's intense. Whereas in other cultures, that kind of emotion would be inappropriate or excessive. So American and European cultures, women can show sadness, men can show anger. There are certain gender rules on which emotion is appropriate and how much for each gender, but we tend to show those emotions very easily. Some Eastern cultures focus more on hiding emotions, especially if they're negative emotions. So you don't have that exuberant show of emotion. It's more restrained and more contained. So this can be an issue for a Southern person, from the United States. If, they're used to going to a church where you hug and you shake hands and you're like on each other's necks, blah, blah, blah. And then they go to a different culture that isn't touchy-feely. There can be a bit of like a jet lag emotionally. Like you don't understand what's going on. Maybe they don't like me. And it's like, no, it's not that they don't like you. It's just that there are different display rules for how you interact. There's actually schools in the military, like the Culture and Language Center at Maxwell Air Force Base, that focuses on communication between different cultures and certain display rules and cultural rules, even with like which hand you're supposed to shake with or which symbols or hand gestures could be considered offensive or inappropriate based on that cultural background. Now, in terms of y'all's background as Zoomers, back in my day when texting first became a thing, and the internet first became a thing, yes, I'm old, we had to figure out a way to add facial language to our tone in typing. And that's how emojis were born. We didn't have the images like y'all have that you can just put up. We had to make it out of letters like XD for eyes closed, laughing out loud, or O_O for like big eyes. Or I think there's like one like uwu. Is that what y'all do? Exactly. So we would use letters to create faces, to create facial language so we could better communicate our tone. Because sometimes tone is hard to read when it's typed. You don't have the voice inflections. You don't have the facial expressions to read off. Like, are they being sarcastic? Are they being funny? Like what's going on? And so we had to create emojis, basically hieroglyphics, for the purpose of communicating and to communicate our intent and our tone. So even as we move away from face-to-face contact, we still use facial language to communicate effectively. So if we can read emotions, then we should be able to read whether or not someone is telling the truth or lying to us. All right, so in the search for a way to determine whether or not someone was lying or not lying, the polygraph machine was invented. Now, the polygraph is no longer admissible in court because it is flawed. And because a researcher known as Elizabeth Loftus studied false memories and how our memories could be recalibrated or changed or influenced to change how the story went. A lot of that deals with framing. It's not the person trying to lie. They actually believe that this memory occurred, but it's just the way that they're recollecting it is not true to form. So like if you're at court or an officer is talking to you and they're like, okay, where were you standing when the car crashed into the other vehicle? Well, if you use that framing of crashed, then that elevates the sense of damage. It elevates the effect of that crash. Versus if you said, okay, where were you standing when the red car bumped into the yellow car? If you say bumped, you're like, okay, maybe there was a dent, like a tiny one, or a little bit of transplanting of the paint, but not a crash, not as much damage. That framing can affect recollection of the memory. So how the polygraph machine works is that it measures your physical responses because emotions and thoughts are subjective. And so it registers the arousal of your sympathetic nervous system. It measures how much you sweat, whether your heart rate changes, your blood pressure, your breathing, in order to ascertain whether or not you're lying. Now, do people sweat and have their heart rate increase when they lie? Yes, but that's assuming a causal relationship. There could be other confounding variables that are leading to those changes in the sympathetic nervous system. What other confounding variables could there be that could deviate the effectiveness of a polygraph test? Yeah, anxiety or nervousness. If you're taking a polygraph test, that's not a good place to be. Something's going on. Okay, so you could be really nervous because even though you didn't do anything, you're just nervous about the whole process. So it could be more anxiety or nervousness, or maybe you have an anxiety disorder. Someone could take medications to hide their sympathetic nervous system, like if they're taking Xanax or Vistaril, okay, something for anxiety, a depressant to bring down their heart rate. Sociopaths, they don't get flustered in their sympathetic nervous system when they're lying. So it doesn't necessarily mean that a polygraph is going to show that you're lying or not. It just shows whether you're good at lying or not, or maybe if you're just nervous. So you can pass a polygraph test without having told the truth, or you could fail a polygraph test without having lied, because there's too many confounding variables. So the range of the accuracy of a polygraph varies widely. On the low end, 70% accurate, which is like a C. On the high end, 95. So you may think, oh wait, 95% accurate, that's good. Well, think of it this way. With 70% accuracy, if you have 1,000 employees, 5 of them were doing something wrong. If you test all of the employees, you're going to find 285 wrongly accused, that they take the polygraph and they fail. You only had 50 of the employees were actually guilty, but you assume that 285 of them were. That's a big jump. What about with 95% accuracy? Well, if you have one person out of 1,000 employees who's actually guilty, and you test all 1,000 of those employees, you're still going to find 49 people wrongly accused based on their polygraph tests. So whether it's 70 or 95%, you're still going to have people who are wrongly accused, which is why polygraphs are so controversial. Their validity is called into question. With the validity of an experiment or a test, you redo the test over and over again to get the same results. If you get the same results each time, then it's valid. If you don't get the same results each time, then it's not valid. So the validity of this polygraph testing is called into question, because even though we can do a correlational tie of physical reactions to lying, there's no one physical reaction that can determine if someone is lying. So if the polygraph isn't effective at helping us determine whether someone's lying or telling the truth, is there another way? Well, it takes a lot more practice and a lot more work than a polygraph. Paul Ekman tried to create a scientific method to interpret and to document all human expressions and to label them, the universal expressions that people show for certain emotions. So Paul Ekman came up with the facial coding system, FACS, in 1933, where he studied the involuntary facial muscle movements in response to emotions. Now, those are called micro expressions. They're called micro expressions because they're very, very tiny and they happen very, very fast. If I show you a picture of someone experiencing emotion, then you could probably stare at it and say, okay, I think that they're this emotion. But you can't just freeze people's faces like that in your day-to-day life. Okay, so with training, Paul Ekman was able to document the muscles in the face that moved in order to interpret facial expressions. But you'd either have to record them and watch them over and over, or you would just have to be very, very well trained in order to interpret the most common ones. Because remember, there's over 5,000 of them. Now, these micro expressions are very difficult to conceal because it's your face involuntarily responding to the emotion that you're feeling. Like if you're surprised, you're going to act surprised. Your face is going to register that. Now, Paul Ekman's work was actually used to create a TV show based on microexpressions called Lie to Me, and it actually is based in the science of the FACS. They do suspend disbelief a few times, where they're like, we're going to catch terrorists based on their facial expressions. Like they have to do like exciting new things in new episodes, so it kind of gets weird after a while. But the first season, it's pretty good. So some of the telltale signs of emotions include, for sadness, your eyes get droopy, you unfocus your eyes, like they're looking into the distance or you're thinking. And of course, with the mouth, you have a slight downturn in the corners. Not necessarily like a full like clown face sad, we live in a society, but just like a little bit at the corners. With anger, obviously the eyebrows, they're going to be furrowed, but they're not going to be furrowed up, they're going to be furrowed down. The eyes are going to glare. They're not going to be unfocused. They're going to be looking directly at the thing that's making them angry. And you have a tightening and narrowing of the lips as you press your mouth together. Now, contempt, remember, is disgust and anger put together. So these two emotions combine to create contempt. Now, paradoxically, one of the ways that you can identify contempt is if they smile. Now, a genuine smile will have both corners of the mouth go up. A contempt smile will only have one corner of the mouth turned up. So only half of their face is smiling at you, and that lip corner kind of tightens. With disgust, obviously, nose wrinkling, eyebrows furrowing, and your upper lip curling or raising. Surprise lasts only for 1 second. If someone keeps their face in that expression, then they're faking it. The eyebrows go up, the eyes get wide, and your mouth drops open. Versus fear, similar to surprise, the eyebrows still go up, but they pull together and up. Your eyelids get bigger so that you can see better to react to fight or flight. Your eyelids get tense at the bottom, and your mouth stretches out, and it may open. So I have a short 4-minute video covering this TV show and giving some insight into some of those micro expressions that they use to identify when people are lying or telling the truth.
I've instructed my client to remain silent. He's not going to talk.
Oh, it's okay. That's okay. I don't have much faith in words myself. Now, statistically speaking, average person tells 3 lies per 10 minutes of conversation. And granted, it's just regular people. We haven't studied any people who are planning to firebomb a black church. Could skew differently.
We don't have time for this scientist to talk to the guy. We went at him for 4 hours and got nothing.
Now, the FBI knows you want mass casualties. So right now, ATF is searching every inch of the 2 largest black churches in the state. FBI got it wrong. Well, there's a shocker. Not one of those 2 churches. Maybe you want one of the smaller churches. One of the black suburbs.
You know what you're talking about. Don't respond.
What do you say ATF starts with Southbridge? No, I'm only kidding. We're going to skip that one. We're going to focus on Lawton. You feel good about it? That's it, Lawton. Gone after a church in Lawton.
That accusation has no basis.
What do you mean? You just told me. The ATF found a pipe bomb in the church basement in Lawton an hour later.
DOD friend of mine said this guy's a total nut job. But he spent like 3 years in the African jungle with some primitive tribes studying their eyebrows.
What's his reaction to my statement? Right now, ATF is searching every inch of the 2 largest black churches in the state. Now, what you just saw there was a brief expression of happiness on his face, which he was trying his best to conceal. It lasted for less than 1/5 of a second as what we call a micro-expression. Now, look at his mouth. The suspect is secretly happy about the locations we are searching, which tells me we have the wrong locations. Now I tell him of our new plan, and...
You know what you're talking about.
Classic one-sided shrug. Translation, I have absolutely no confidence in what I just said. The body contradicts the words. He's lying. Yeah.
When you accuse a suspect and he acts surprised, is there a way to tell if it's real or if he's just trying to look innocent?
Now, that's real surprise. Lasts for less than a second when it comes across your face. But if your suspect is surprised for more than a second, he's faking it. He's lying. Now, I call out that his target is actually Lawton, and watch it again. Concealed scorn. One personal tip, you see this micro-expression in your spouse's face, your marriage is coming to an end. Trust me. Yeah.
Don't these micro-expressions vary depending on the person?
Let's leave this up, and we'll go to the Cato Kalin footage from the OJ trial.
Mr. Kalin, you got a lot of money for your appearance on Current Affair, didn't you?
Yeah. Scorn. Scorn. Huge scorn. Shame, shame, and shame. Contempt. These expressions are universal. Emotion looks the same whether you're a suburban housewife or a suicide bomber. The truth is written on all our faces.
Alrighty. So, how do we deal with emotions that have very strong negative valence? Okay, well, the catharsis theory says that with anger or other aggressive energy, we can release that through behavior. So an emotional release to pent-up emotion. So if someone's ever responded to frustration by getting a pillow and screaming into it, like as loud as you can, but you muffle it. Or if you go to the gym and punch a punching bag. Okay, this is the theory that we can relieve those aggressive urges safely by reaching a catharsis. So by that logic, you don't want to suppress your emotions. You don't want to let them build up because then it's harder to reach that catharsis. If you're angry or you're sad, then find something that can help you release that, whether it's writing in a journal, screaming into a pillow, or crying. So in addition to our facial expressions, we can also have body language that indicates how we're feeling. So like, for instance, the body posture of this giraffe indicates that in this comic, his nonverbal communication is that he is the giraffe that is experiencing depression. And a lot of studies have gone into looking at body posture for communication. Like if you see somebody sitting with their arms crossed and their legs crossed and their leg pointing towards the door, then it means they don't want to be there. Versus if they're facing you and their shoulders are open and their arms are open, and if they're making eye contact, that indicates interest. You can also build rapport with people. If you want somebody to like you and you're first meeting them, you can copy their body posture, and then they unconsciously will start copying yours. So building that nonverbal rapport in addition to the conversation that you're having. Or if you T-pose to show dominance. All right, we're going to do a little practice with the theories of emotion. Remember, with the two-factor theory, the first factor is physical. The second factor is we appraise our emotion and label it. Cannon-Bard, remember I told y'all to think of two cannons and what they're doing. And then James Lang says that we have a causal relationship. So in this example, Christine is holding her baby when a fierce dog appears out of nowhere and teeth bared leaps for the baby's face. Christine immediately ducks for cover to protect the baby, screams at the dog, and notices that her heart is banging and she's broken out in a cold sweat. How would James Lang explain this emotional response? What comes first, the physical or the emotional?
The physical comes first, which causes the emotional.
Good. The physical comes first, followed by the emotion. This is the opposite of the common sense theory, which would say the emotion causes the physical. So her banging heart and the sweat that she's experienced has led to her emotion of fear. What about the Cannon-Bard theory? What happens there? Which comes first? Which comes last?
They happen at the same time.
They happen at the same time, like two cannons firing. So her response and her fear happen at the exact same split second. What about the two-factor theory? What's the first factor?
Physical response.
The physical response. What's the second factor?
We label it.
We label the emotion. So this involves cognition. So how are these different from the two-factor theory? The two-factor theory says we have to appraise what's going on to label our emotion. Whereas Cannon and Bard said, actually, it happens at the same time. There's no cause and effect. It's just, bam, simultaneous. Whereas the two-factor theory says we have a physical reaction, and then we have to interpret our context. So she was just attacked by a dog. She's going to appraise that as, oh, I'm afraid. As opposed to if the mailman walked by and he's super cute, if her heart started beating and she got sweaty and nervous, she might think, oh, I have a crush on him, rather than I'm afraid of the mailman. So our cognitive label plays a role in this theory. So you have an event and an emotional response. In the two-factor theory, with that emotional response, you appraise what's going on cognitively. With the other two theories, the emotional response occurs at the same time with Cannon-Bard as the physical response. With the James Lang theory, it's the physical before the emotional response. But in emotion, you are going to have a physical reaction, behavior that results from that, like facial expressions, and a subjective experience, meaning what you think about what happened. So you have the physical, the behavioral, and the cognitive.